I will address gendered city space in the Hebrew Bible. It's part of a larger project on city conceptualization in the Bible. So not everything I work on has to do with women or female portrayal. There are a lot of studies on cities as women, as females in the Bible, and I just have a few up there. Some of those names may ring a bell. A lot of the books address a few topics that recur, and on the one hand there's where does this ID come from, where does the image of the city as a woman comes from. Another topic that is addressed a lot is what do we do, especially as contemporary readers, with the often negative and violent portrayal of these city women. What I will be doing today will address that, but it will also or mainly focus on what are the advantages of the portrayal. So a lot of the studies have to do with the problems, the issues that we find, but obviously when writers rely on such imagery, they also have good reasons to do so, and I will talk about the good reasons, so to speak. First, I will offer a little bit of a background. So where does the metaphor comes from? It's something addressed in previous studies, and over time different reasonings, different proposals have been developed. The first one has to do with the cultural context of where the text arises from. And on the one hand we have Mesopotamian influence, on the other hand we have the West Semitic tradition. And the Hebrew Bible takes a position somewhere in between. So it draws on both traditions and it adopts what works for their cultural setting and the message they want to communicate. So from the Mesopotamian tradition, they will adopt the idea that cities have patron deities and that there's a relationship between the patron and the city that needs to be protected. On the other hand, in the West Semitic tradition, this imagery is taken further, not one step but two steps, with the city becoming the spouse of the patron deity, and not just the spouse, but she's also deified. In the biblical context, as you all know, there's only one God, so having a deified city is a problem, but it's not a problem to present her as the spouse or as a female character, and that's what they do. So that's the cultural explanation. It doesn't tell us much if we're reading the text and we want to see how this image works in a text, then we can do a lot with that theory. That's where linguistics comes in, and from a linguistic point of view, scholars have said, well, we see in biblical Hebrew, like in other West Semitic languages, the grammatical gender for cities and for words for city, like Ir, Kirya, and Keret, is feminine. So obviously when we want to turn this into a metaphor, when we want to turn this into a personification, we end up with a female figure rather than a male figure. This only works to a certain degree because, like I said, this is part of a larger project, and we'll see that a lot of the passages on cities in the Hebrew Bible are not personified, and we still have all these feminine forms and these feminine endings. So the language only works to the degree that it will facilitate a metaphorical transfer. So when you personify the city and you see all the feminine forms and endings, it helps you as a reader to think of the city as a woman, but it's not a condition. It's not because the forms are feminine that you get the female imagery. Later on, scholars will turn again to linguistics, more in particular to cognitive linguistics, and they'll say, well, it's about how we think about cities, and so we think of a female figure, and that's what the impact is, and they see a connection between the city as an enclosure with people in them, and then a woman, possibly an enclosure with a child in it, and that's then the connection they see. A literary explanation brings us to metaphor. Metaphor as literary metaphor, so then in that case they say, well, this female personification of cities, it's a literary skill, it's a literary tool from the writers. They want to render the account vivid, they want to engage their readers, they want to draw their attention, and that's why they use this metaphor. The literary explanation is the explanation that will say most of what happens in the text and what it means for a reader, but it seems to overestimate the literariness of the image, and it does not make a distinction between a concept on the one hand and the actual expressions in the text. And that's what more cognitive-oriented theories will do. And then as a last step, there are more integrated approaches, and with integrated I mean that these scholars like Maggie Lowe and Crystal Meyer, they rely on more than one theory. For instance, the book of Lowe on Mother Zion in Deuteronomy draws both on the notion of conceptual metaphor and intertextuality, and so it brings together different ideas. It shows that this metaphor is far more complex than originally people assumed. So that's like the general background, that's what the studies that have been done. What I will be doing today, or the methodology I want to propose today, is called Cognitive-Stylistics. In short, what does this discipline do? It's interested in what happens when we read. So as a reader, when we come across a text, how do we produce meaning? And the cognitive adjective already points you in the direction where they draw most of their ideas and concepts from. That's from the cognitive field, from cognitive linguistics, cognitive psychology, but they'll not just be drawing on that, they will connect it to concepts and terms, key terms from the literary field. So they really kind of bridge a gap between existing fields, and they try to address what happens when we read. To just give you one example, in terms of how they combine that. So we know metaphor from the literary field, a literary metaphor, a novel metaphor, that's the actual expression in the text. For cognitive stylistics, dependent will be conceptual metaphor, that's the metaphor behind the text that not necessarily leads to a literary metaphor in the text. In my talk today on gendered city space, I will be relying on two theories, more in particular, being conceptual metaphor theory, and of course the big names are up there, and on the other hand, the notion of framing from framing theory. So how does that work? Well, this is an example, an excerpt from Jeremiah 4, and in that excerpt we see how the city is personified and how she's personified as a female figure. If you read that text, nowhere in the text actually the term woman is used, so you can't really pull out one sentence where you say, oh, that's the metaphor. And that's because what we're dealing here with is a conceptual metaphor. So it's an idea behind the text. And the idea is that Jeremiah presents the city of Jerusalem as a woman, and there's several elements that actually point us into that direction. She's wearing clothes, she's wearing jewelry, she's beauty, she has lovers, and then she's also compared as somebody who's giving birth, who's in travail, and who has a first child. So all of these elements together, all these words in the text, lead us to the image like the city is a woman, and that's what's conceptual metaphor is about. Interesting about the theory is that you distinguish between, on the one hand, a source domain, and on the other hand, a target domain. In this case, the source domain would be the woman, and the target domain would be the city. A lot of the studies that have been done, especially the ones that deal with what can this mean for contemporary readers, how do we deal with the violent imagery, focus on the source domain a lot. So they kind of stick with the imagery and how they portray female characters and women, but they don't kind of make this connection. What the metaphor is about the city, and the writers want to say first and foremost something about city space. So in a way you could say that for contemporary readers, the metaphor fails. It doesn't really work because we're so much focused on this source domain, but it's something we have to keep in mind to see what it does for the text. That there is a target domain as well, and that the text wants to tell us something about the target domain. The second notion that I want to bring in is framing. Why do I want to bring this in? Well, in conceptual metaphor theory, there's an emphasis on these metaphors kind of come to us naturally. They're to a certain degree actually unconscious. And so by bringing in the notion of framing, we're bringing back the idea of consciousness, and that writers actually use a metaphor on purpose for for particular reasons, and so they'll use one metaphor over another. And I've given two examples there. So the one we're going to talk about today is the city as a woman. But another conceptual metaphor that we find for city space in the biblical corpus is the city as an object. And you immediately see the big difference there. A person has agency, an object does not have agency. So if you as a writer present your city as a woman or you present it as an object, you will tell a very different story and you will create a very different idea about city space. So framing is very important. Good. In what remains, I will focus on a very particular image of city space, of female city space, namely that of the mother. The role of the mother kind of fits within a larger, what I've called an extended family metaphor. So all of the female portrayals of city space in the Hebrew Bible can be mapped in this diagram. And there's two central relationships, that of the husband and the wife, and obviously the husband is then not a female person, and the relationship between the mother and the child. So those are the central ones. We also find a few passages where she's presented as a sister, so you work on the sibling relationship. And then there's a lot of the passages that actually address the relationships that threaten those two core relationships, like the adulteress, the whore, the widow, either the woman who cannot give birth, who's barren, or the one who has lost her children. So all of these fit in there. Three observations there. First one, a little bit remarkable perhaps, is that when we have city women or wives, we do not necessarily have city mothers. So these two roles do not seem to coincide. There's one major exception for that, and that's the book of Isaiah, especially Deutero-Isaiah, where you do see that these two metaphors are used together consistently. In the other prophets, that doesn't happen. And that gives a lot of opportunities for the writers, because that means that they can use this metaphor for any city, and that's also what they do. We find it for Babylon, we find it for Nineveh, we find it for Jerusalem. So these connections, if you untie this connection, you can talk about all of the cities as being mothers. If this connection is not made, that has another implication that brings me to the second point. That is, what is really important in this metaphor is the role or the connection between the parent and the child. And not so much this triad of the father, the mother, and the child, but actually it's about the parent and the child. And we see that also for other passages of the Bible, where even God is portrayed as a parent, and sometimes that's as a mother, sometimes that is as a child, even though the biblical God is grammatically male. So you also see that there's this fluidity in that case. This relationship is important, and metaphorically, then the city or the mother would kind of stand for the city, very often the physical city, and the child would be the inhabitants. Not always, and I have a nice example. I apologize for not bringing enough handouts, but I have an example, I don't have it here, from Nahum, from chapter 3, so the prophet Nahum, where he speaks about the city of Nineveh and how it will be destroyed. And there, the city is envisioned as being a mother, and her children, actually her babies, will be killed on the streets, basically literally by smashing them literally on the streets. It's a very violent image. And there it seems that the children actually stand for more than just the inhabitants. They stand for the future of the city, and we see in other passages that this connection between the future and the children is very important in this metaphor. So the children are the embodiment of a future city, and in this context it makes sense. If you want to destroy Nineveh, you also want to make sure that there will be no Nineveh at a later point of time. So you want to not just destroy the inhabitants, you want to destroy everything of it. You want to destroy the idea of its future. So that's for parent and child. A last remark I want to make has to do with linguistic dependency. So the relationship between parent and child is a dependent relationship. You have an older family member taking care of a younger one. It's also something we see in the language itself. So the way in which these passages, these metaphors are evoked is through expressions like the child of, and then you have a place, Zion, Jerusalem, Babylon, or as the word child, but then with a pronominal suffix attached to it. So your child or her child, depending on what type of discourse we're in. So this linguistic equivalent or the idea of dependency is also something we see in the language itself. So if I sum up this first part on the extended family metaphor, we see that so the city mother is one of the female roles of the city, and the emphasis is really on the parent-child relationship. Wives are not necessarily mothers, and there is a linguistic equivalent for this dependency relation, so for the concept in the text itself. So let's move on to my second point, and that's that we go from mother spaces to home spaces. So if we look at all of these passages where city mothers are evoked, and then we're talking about 58 references, we see a few notions that recur, notions of dependency, of care, of safety, of continuity, familiarity. Just to give you one example, so the dependency one in Lamentations 2:19, the prophet calls upon the city to pray for her children so that they will survive. So that's the idea of the mother must take care of her children. The idea of continuity, to come back to the Nahum example, if you kill the children, then there is no continuity. So it kind of goes against what you expect from a mother and what you, in this case, that expect from a city. So these notions are very important. They're not only important for the passages for city mothers, but they also bring to mind another concept, and that's the concept of home space. If you look at studies of home space, all of these terms will recur. You will find them all, and they have to do with what Thuan has defined as a sense of place, meaning that we as human beings try to, when we say a place is home, it means we have an affective bond with this place somehow, and that's similar to the bond between a mother or a parent and a child. So this connection can be made there. We can in a way read the Bible as a journey to a home space where one day Jerusalem will be the home, and the whole Bible is kind of a search for that. And at particular passages, the biblical text will try to build up a textual, a temporary home space, even when Jerusalem is destroyed, by working with this language and playing upon these concepts. A nice example for that is Psalm 137. It's the famous psalm by the rivers of Babylon, where the Israelites are in exile. They're in Babylon. Babylon is described. It's a space. Also in that psalm, we find the metaphor of the mother. Babylon is the mother, and her children will be killed. So there's no future for Babylon, but the future is for Jerusalem, even though at that point in time, Jerusalem is non-existent, being the physical Jerusalem. But there is a play in this text where the psalmist builds up a spatial narrative between an absent physical Jerusalem with a strong mental counterpart and a present physical Babylon, but that's rejected as a home space. So it's really very strong dialogue, very strong discourse that's developed there. Last point I'd like to make is the framing. So I have a longer text from Isaiah 49, and in this text you see very well illustrated how one actually works and plays with this metaphor, and how the city mother becomes a focal point of movement. So it begins with saying that the city has children, but she's lost them, and then somehow at the end they come back to her, God will bring them back to her. Verse 21 is very interesting. It kind of stands in between, and it really plays with this idea of the real and the unreal at the same time, because it seems that she didn't even give birth to the children, so how can they be her children to start with? She's also called barren in the beginning. But we're kind of being thrown back and forward there. But ultimately, it's the city mother. That space is the one that defines the children. And she mentions, I was left all alone, but basically she's never alone because there's always she's this focal point that the children, the inhabitants in this case, move back and forward to her. Also linguistically, it's very interesting, and I don't have the time to go into this, but just very briefly, and I don't have the Hebrew on there, but in the Hebrew text, you'll see that the children are referred to as ele, as these, so they use a demonstrative noun. At the end of the passage, all of a sudden, the children become heaven, they become they, so they become a personal pronoun, and throughout the text, the I in this passage is the mother space, it's the city, it's Jerusalem, and she's referred to as Ani. So at the end, they become from the same linguistic category, so there's also there a movement, a coming closer to each other. So it's really played out very well. So let me just sum it up all. The biblical writers, according to me, have chosen a powerful image when they depict the city as a mother. It allows them to emphasize the relationship between city and inhabitants or future city and explore the associations that come with the image, both linguistically and conceptually. Mother cities are emotional, and so is violence against them, even though they are at times perpetrators themselves. So there are passages where the mothers actually sacrifice the children. Any city can be mother because all cities have inhabitants and a presumed future. Similarly, they all carry the potential of home space, but in the frame of the biblical text, only Jerusalem will live up to that potential to become both home to God's people and to God Himself. Thank you.